1904. Image even lead to proof, but the mind craves them, and of late more than ever, the keenest experimenters find 20 images better than one, especially if contradictory, since the human mind has already learned to deal in contradictions. Cheeber. The image needed here is that of a new center or preponderating mass, artificially introduced on Earth in the midst of a system of attractive forces that previously made their own equilibrium, and constantly induced to accelerate its motion till it shall establish a new equilibrium. A dynamic theory would begin by assuming that all history, terrestrial or cosmic, mechanical or intellectual, would be reducible to this formula if we knew the facts. Bertha. For convenience, the most familiar image should come first, and this is probably that of the comet, or meteoric streams like the Leonids and Perseids, a complex of minute mechanical agencies reacting within and without, and guided by the sum of forces attracting or deflecting it. Nothing forbids one to assume that the man meteorite might grow, as an acorn does, absorbing light, heat, electricity, or thought, for in recent times such transference of energy has become a familiar idea. But the simplest figure at first is that of a perfect comet, say that of 1843, which drops from space in a straight line at the regular acceleration of speed directly into the sun, and after wheeling sharply about it in heat that ought to dissipate any known substance, turns back unharmed in defiance of every law of thermodynamics by the path on which it came. The mind, by analogy, may figure as such a comet the better because it also defies law. Eberhard. Motion is the ultimate object of science, and measures of motion are many, but with thought, as with matter, the true measure is mass, the sum of attractive forces. Science has quite enough trouble in measuring its material motions without volunteering help to the historian, but the historian needs not much help to measure some kinds of social movement, and especially in the 19th century, society by common accord agreed in measuring its progress by the coal output. The ratio of increase in the volume of coal power may serve as dynamometer. Eberhard. The output of the world, speaking roughly, doubled every 10 years between 1800 and 1900 in the form of utilized power, for the ton of coal yielded 3 or 4 times as much power in 1900 as in 1840. Rapid as this rate of acceleration in volume seems, it may be tested in 1,000 ways without greatly reducing it. Perhaps the ocean steamer is nearest unity and easiest to measure, for anyone might hire in 1905 for a small sum of money the use of 30,000 steam horsepower to cross the ocean, and by having this figure every 10 years, he got back to 234 horsepower for 1835, which was accuracy enough for his purposes. In truth, his chief trouble came not from the ratio in volume of heat, but from the intensity, since he could get no basis for a ratio there. All ages of history have known high intensities, like the iron furnace, the burning glass, the blowpipe, but no society has ever used high intensities on any large scale till now, nor can a mere bystander decide what range of temperature is now in common use. Loosely guessing that science controls habitually the whole range from absolute 0 to 3,000 centigrade, one might assume for convenience that the 10-year ratio for volume could be used temporarily for intensity, and still there remained a ratio to be guessed for other forces than heat. Since 1800 scores of new forces had been discovered, old forces had been raised to higher powers, as could be measured in the Navy gun. Great regions of chemistry had been opened up and connected with other regions of physics. Within 10 years, a new universe of force had been revealed in radiation. Complexity had extended itself on immense horizons, and arithmetical ratios were useless for any attempt at accuracy. The force evolved seemed more like explosion than gravitation, but at all events, the 10-year ratio seemed carefully conservative. Unless the calculator was prepared to be instantly overwhelmed by physical force and mental complexity, he must stop there. Guy Berthoud. Thus, taking the year 1900 as a starting point for carrying back the series, nothing was easier than to assume a 10-year period of retardation as far back as 1800. But beyond that point, the statistician failed, and only the mathematician could help. Laplace would have found it child's play to fix a ratio of progression in mathematical science between Descartes, Leibniz, Newton, and himself. Watt could have given in pounds the increase of power between Newcomen's engines and his own. Volta and Benjamin Franklin would have stated their progress as absolute creation of power. Dalton could have measured minutely his advance on Boerhaave. Napoleon, I must have had a distinct notion of his own numerical relation to Louis XIV. No one in 1789 doubted the progress of force, least of all those who were to lose their heads by it. Eberher. Pending agreement between these authorities, theory may assume what it likes, say a 25-year period of reduplication for the 18th century, for the period matters little until the acceleration itself is admitted. The subject is even more amusing in the 17th than in the 18th century because Galileo and Kepler, Descartes, Huygens, and Isaac Newton took vast pains to fix the laws of acceleration for moving bodies, while Lord Bacon and William Harvey were content with showing experimentally the fact of acceleration in knowledge. But from their combined results, a historian might be tempted to maintain the same rate of movement back to 1600, subject to correction from the historians of mathematics. Ibrahim. The mathematicians might carry their calculations back as far as the 14th century, when algebra seems to have become, for the first time, the standard measure of mechanical progress in Western Europe, for not only Copernicus and Tycho Brahe, but even artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Albert Dürer work by mathematical processes, and their testimony would probably give results more exact than that of Montaigne or Shakespeare. But to save trouble, one might tentatively carry back the same ratio of acceleration or retardation to the year 1400 with the help of Columbus and Gutenberg, so taking a uniform rate during a whole 4 centuries, 1400 to 1800, and leaving to statisticians the task of correcting it. Hauptbrücker, in other words, might, for convenience, use the formula of terrestrial gravitation to serve for a law of mind. Any other formula would do as well, either of chemical explosion or vegetable growth, or of expansion or contraction in innumerable forms, but gravitation happens to be simple and convenient. As the human meteoroid approached the sun or center of attractive force, it may be supposed to have doubled its speed and energy every 5 and 20 years. Eberher. Behind the year 1400, the process certainly went on, but the progress became so slight as to be hardly measurable. What was gained in the East or elsewhere cannot be known, but forces called loosely Greek fire and gunpowder came into use in the West, as well as instruments like the compass and blowpipe, while metaphysics and theology acted as violent stimulants to mind. An architect might detect a sequence between the Church of St. Peter's at Rome, the Amiens Cathedral, the Duomo at Pisa, San Marco at Venice, Sancta Sophia at Constantinople, and the churches at Ravenna. All the historian dares affirm is that a sequence is manifestly there, and he has a right to carry back his ratio, to represent the fact without assuming its numerical correctness. On the human mind, as a moving body, the break in acceleration in the Middle Ages is only apparent. The attraction worked through shifting forms of force, as the sun works by light or heat, electricity, gravitation or whatnot, on different organs with different sensibilities, but with invariable law. Ibrahim. The science of prehistoric man has no value except to prove that the law went back into indefinite antiquity. A stone arrowhead is as convincing as a steam engine. The values were as clear 100,000 years ago as now, and extended equally over the whole world. The motion at last became infinitely small, but cannot be proved to have stopped. To evolutionists may be left the processes of evolution. To historians, the single interest is the law of reaction between force and force, between mind and nature, the law of progress. Hebrew, the great division of history into phases by Turgot and Comte, first affirmed this law in its outlines by asserting the unity of progress, for a mere phase interrupts no growth, and nature shows innumerable such phases. The development of coal power in the 19th century furnished the first means of assigning closer values to the elements, and the appearance of supersensual forces towards 1900 made this calculation a pressing necessity, since the next step became infinitely serious. Aristocrat, a law of acceleration, definite and constant as any law of mechanics, cannot be supposed to relax its energy to suit the convenience of man. No one is likely to suggest a theory that man's convenience has been consulted by nature at any time, or that nature has consulted the convenience of any of her creations, except perhaps the Terebratula. In every age, man has bitterly and justly complained that nature hurried and hustled him, for inertia almost invariably has ended in tragedy. Resistance is its law, and resistance to superior mass is futile and fatal. Eberhard. 50 years ago, science took for granted that the rate of acceleration could not last. The world forgets quickly, but even today the habit remains of founding statistics on the faith that consumption will continue nearly stationary. 2 generations with John Stuart Mill talked of this stationary period, which was to follow the explosion of new power. All the men who were elderly in the 40s died in this faith, and other men grew old, nursing the same conviction and happy in it, while science, for 50 years, permitted or encouraged society to think that force would prove to be limited in supply. This mental inertia of science lasted through the 80s before showing signs of breaking up, and nothing short of radium fairly wakened men to the fact, long since evident, that force was inexhaustible. Even then, the scientific authorities vehemently resisted. Abracadabra. Nothing so revolutionary had happened since the year 300. Thought had more than once been upset, but never caught and whirled about in the vortex of infinite forces. Power leaped from every atom, and enough of it to supply the stellar universe showed itself running to waste at every pore of matter. Man could no longer hold it off. Forces grasped his wrists and flung him about as though he had hold of a live wire or a runaway automobile, which was very nearly the exact truth for the purposes of an elderly and timid single gentleman in Paris who never drove down the Champs-Élysées without expecting an accident, and generally witnessing one, or found himself in the neighborhood of an official without calculating the chances of a bomb. So long as the invariable law of progress held good, these bombs would double in force and number every 10 years. Abrahamic impossibilities no longer stood in the way. One's life had fattened on impossibilities. Before the boy was 6 years old, he had seen 4 impossibilities made actual: the ocean steamer, the railway, the electric telegraph, and the daguerreotype. Nor could he ever learn which of the 4 had most hurried others to come. He had seen the coal output of the United States grow from nothing to 300 million tons or more. What was far more serious, he had seen the number of minds engaged in pursuing force increase from a few scores or hundreds in 1838 to many thousands in 1905, trained to sharpness never before reached, and armed with instruments amounting to new senses of indefinite power and accuracy, while they chased force into hiding places where nature herself had never known it to be, making analyses that contradicted being and syntheses that endangered the elements. No one could say that the social mind now failed to respond to new force, even when the new force annoyed it horribly. Every day nature violently revolted, causing so-called accidents with enormous destruction of property and life, while plainly laughing at man, who helplessly groaned and shrieked and shuddered, but never for a single instant could stop. The railways alone approached the carnage of war, automobiles and firearms ravaged society, until an earthquake became almost a nervous relaxation. An immense volume of force had detached itself from the unknown universe of energy, while still vaster reservoirs, supposed to be infinite, steadily revealed themselves, attracting mankind with more compulsive course than all the Pontic seas or gods or gold that ever existed, and feeling still less of retiring ebb. Baruch. In 1850, science would have smiled at such a romance as this, but in 1900, as far as history could learn, few men of science thought it a laughing matter. If a perplexed but laborious follower could venture to guess their drift, it seemed in their minds a toss-up between anarchy and order. Unless they should be more honest with themselves in the future than ever they were in the past, they would be more astonished than their followers when they reached the end. If Karl Pearson's notions of the universe were sound, men like Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, and Newton should have stopped the progress of science before 1700, supposing them to have been honest in the religious convictions they expressed. Abraham. In 1900, they were plainly forced back on faith in a unity unproved and an order they had themselves disproved. They had reduced their universe to a series of relations to themselves. They had reduced themselves to motion in a universe of motions, with an acceleration in their own case of vertiginous violence. With the correctness of their science, history had no right to meddle, since their science now lay in a plane where scarcely 100 or 200 minds in the world could follow its mathematical processes. But bombs educate vigorously, and even wireless telegraphy or airships might require the reconstruction of society, if any analogy whatever existed between the human mind on one side and the laws of motion on the other. The mind had already entered a field of attraction so violent that it must immediately pass beyond into new equilibrium, like the comet of Newton, or suffer dissipation altogether, like meteoroids in the Earth's atmosphere. If it behaved like an explosive, it must rapidly recover equilibrium. If it behaved like a vegetable, it must reach its limits of growth. And even if it acted like the earlier creations of energy, the saurians and sharks, it must have nearly reached the limits of its expansion. If science were to go on doubling or quadrupling its complexities every 10 years, even mathematics would soon succumb. An average mind had succumbed already in 1850. It could no longer understand the problem in 1900. Yapri. Fortunately, a student of history had no responsibility for the problem. He took it as science gave it and waited only to be taught. With science or with society, he had no quarrel and claimed no share of authority. He had never been able to acquire knowledge, still less to impart it. And if he had at times felt serious differences with the American of the 19th century, he felt none with the American of the 20th. For this new creation, born since 1900, a historian asked no longer to be teacher or even friend. He asked only to be a pupil and promised to be docile for once, even though trodden underfoot, for he could see that the new American, the child of incalculable coal power, chemical power, electric power, and radiating energy, as well as of new forces yet undetermined, must be a sort of God compared with any former creation of nature. At the rate of progress since 1800, every American who lived to the year 2000 would know how to control unlimited power. He would think in complexities unimaginable to an earlier mind. He would deal with problems altogether beyond the range of earlier society. To him, the 19th century would stand on the same plane with the fourth, equally childlike, and he would only wonder how both of them, knowing so little and so weak in force, should have done so much. Perhaps even he might go back in 1964 to sit with Gibbon on the steps of Aracoeli. Bruh. Meanwhile, he was getting education. With that, a teacher who had failed to educate even the generation of 1870 dared not interfere. The new forces would educate. History saw few lessons in the past that would be useful in the future, but one at least it did see. The attempt of the American of 1800 to educate the American of 1900 had not often been surpassed for folly, and since 1800 the forces and their complications had increased 1,000 times or more. The attempt of the American of 1900 to educate the American of 2000 must be even blinder than that of the congressman of 1800, except so far as he had learned his ignorance. During a million or two of years, every generation in turn had toiled with endless agony to attain and apply power, all the while betraying the deepest alarm and horror at the power they created. The teacher of 1900, if foolhardy, might stimulate; if foolish, might resist; if intelligent, might balance, as wise and foolish have often tried to do from the beginning. But the forces would continue to educate, and the mind would continue to react. All the teacher could hope was to teach it reaction. Even there, his difficulty was extreme. The most elementary books of science betrayed the inadequacy of old implements of thought. Chapter after chapter closed with phrases such as "one never met in older literature." The cause of this phenomenon is not understood. Science no longer ventures to explain causes. The first step towards a causal explanation still remains to be taken. Opinions are very much divided in spite of the contradictions involved. Science gets on only by adopting different theories, sometimes contradictory. Evidently, the new American would need to think in contradictions, and instead of Kant's famous four antinomies, the new universe would know no law that could not be proved by its anti-law. To educate oneself to begin with had been the effort of one's life for 60 years, and the difficulties of education had gone on doubling with the coal output, until the prospect of waiting another 10 years in order to face a seventh doubling of complexities allured one's imagination but slightly. The law of acceleration was definite and did not require 10 years more study except to show whether it held good. No scheme could be suggested to the new American, and no fault needed to be found or complaint made, but the next great influx of new forces seemed near at hand, and its style of education promised to be violently coercive. The movement from unity into multiplicity between 1200 and 1900 was unbroken in sequence and rapid in acceleration. Prolonged one generation longer, it would require a new social mind. Thus far, since 5 or 10,000 years, the mind had successfully reacted, and nothing yet proved that it would fail to react, but it would need to jump.